Hi everyone, Kyoka here, back at it with another Ascent recap video. This time I was at Ascent Akihabara with my Fortuitous Wind Arcane Rye and I had a top 100 placement. And going into the event, I actually wasn't too optimistic just given all the decks I had to cover in terms of threats out there with the rise of Razor Gale and then dealing with aggro, you've got fractals, and then all the typical other level 3 decks. I just felt there was way too much to cover in such a large event. So I had to think about what was it that I was willing to take a risk against from a matchup perspective. And looking back at the event, I had decided to cut Alcahest, and that wasn't really a great decision. Nullifying Lantern, while it came up in a match, it was pretty much useless for most of the event. And while it was the right call to sideboard against Razor Gale, in the end, I only matched up against one Razor Gale. I had sided some Scatter Essences and Nullifying Mirrors. So I think with some of these choices, I was kind of limited in terms of my ceiling at the event. But nonetheless, I finished with in the top 100, and it was a result that I'm pretty proud of. And I did the best I could given the options or given the end state of the deck I decided to bring. I made some considerations for, what should I change in the main board, and there wasn't really too much. The only thing that I really changed was taking out one one summon gale for a resolute stamp because I found myself even against the crux decks that I wanted in a little bit more defense because their goal typically is to try to run you over in the early game. And if you have one piece of defense to stabilize yourself, especially once you go to level 3, you should be able to take those matchups relatively comfortably. The only times you do lose is either if you hard brick or they have a little too much aggression before you can find your winning pieces. This time around, I'm not going to go too much over the deck itself because it didn't really change all that much since my previous video. Instead, I'm going to go over a bit more of the kind of how to play the early game. What cards am I looking for off the early glimpse from Fortuitous Spirit? I'll still go over the meta and kind of give an overall recap of the deck and meta matchups, but I'm not going to spend too much time doing that. Now let's talk about Ascent Akihabara a little bit. I ended up finishing 34th at 941. It turns out in the end I couldn't really hit top 8. I was 6-3 going into day 2, and at best I could have gotten a top 16 finish. But given the deck that I brought, how I didn't have Alcahest for the Oblation decks, how I ended up facing against two fractal matchups where that's a matchup I was willing to take a loss against. I can't really complain against a 941 record. In fact, I thought, at one point I was 3-2 after just facing a Oblation deck, which was pretty much unwinnable without Alcahest. I had lost to a Merlin, unfortunately, just didn't see cards to gain enlightenment counters. So after, bricking the Merlin matchup and losing to Oblation and being at 3-2, I really didn't have much hope to go into day 2, but I was able to, play the rest of the games quite well. And on day 2, I went 3-0 to start with, so I was fairly safe in the top 100 at that point. But in the end, there wasn't really much point to playing for much more after I lost my fourth game, which was the second Fractals matchup. I ID'd the last match to finish 941. Pretty happy with the placement. I think I could have done better with some better sideboard or main deck choices by having Alcahest somewhere, but it is what it is. In the top tables, there's as usual, a decent amount of Crux decks, some Dragon decks. I just think to myself, that Merlin matchup that I lost at 2-0, had I won that, I saw what my opponent faced, and I believe he faced against another Crux deck in the fourth round. So it wouldn't be too out of the question to be at 4-0 to begin with. And you kind of wonder, what could have been if I was able to stick it out around the top tables. But it's not easy. Like, the deck sometimes beats itself. Crux Lorraine isn't. There's a lot of Crux Lorraines, and sometimes they'll find the aggressive opener to beat you. Maybe against Dragon, you don't find your shields, you don't find your Ravaging Tempest. I see there's some Genbu, there's some Wind Wake Up. It's not it's not a walk in the park. And if I face any oblations, which there were quite a bit in the early going at the top tables, that was going to be an auto loss. So 9-4-1, pretty happy with this result. Think I could have done better, but given where I was at 3-2, can't really complain. I don't really need to go over this that much. It wasn't like too different from Niagara, where you have more than a quarter of the deck being Crux, over half the decks being level 3 decks. What did surprise me was the number of arcane decks, at 16 Rye decks out there. I don't know if this is a movement that I started, but I'm pretty happy and surprised to see that there's more arcane decks than Luxem, or actually the same as Luxem, more than Fractals even. So at one point I was playing against a mirror match against another Fortuitous Arcane Rye, and then like to my right I saw someone playing the Wind Rye deck, someone to my left playing the Wind Rye deck. I was just thinking to myself, what in sweet flying fuck is going on here? But I'm pretty happy to see Rye rise and people enjoy the deck. I think the deck is pretty hard to pick up for someone who's not familiar with Rye, and I'll go over a little bit more about just kind of talking about the deck later on. The day 2 results, unfortunately, there wasn't as many that made day 2. I think I was the only one that made day 2, but there were a couple people that were close, and I think it's just difficult when there's a lot of matchup luck involved with the deck, and you still have to play very well in order to beat even some of your favorable matchups. I think in terms of everything else, there were more Oblation decks than I expected, and that kind of caught me off guard. And I wish I brought Alcahest for that. And then as you go into Asia, there tends to be more water, so seeing water allies a bit higher. This is kind of what I expected at Niagara, but now that I see the water ally decks, and they're also a difficult matchup if they have the right opener to pressure you. It just kind of depends, because some of those decks they play cards like Nia, Snow White, and Lunette, and they're one attack allies. They don't really deal a lot of pressure. So unless they can keep you locked down for many turns, or they draw the Jiaying, the water horse, it's difficult for them to pressure you back. So depending on their opener, it can be a walk in the park, or it can be quite difficult to deal with, because you don't really have that many options against a Snow White. And if they tax you on your level ups with Nia, it can just snowball out of control. So this is the day 2 results. Yeah, there is only one arcane there. Not really too surprising. I would definitely expect to see a higher percentage be the level 3 decks. This probably looks to be about more than 60, maybe even 65% of the decks are level 3 decks. So as I mentioned, even with Niagara, like if I just stuck to the top tables, I could have had a good chance. But the problem is, one, just being at an auto loss against Oblation is just a terrible decision on on my part, not packing Alcahest. And then there is a decent amount of Aetherwing, Wind Wake Up, Suzaku, and Shadow Strike. Like, none of these are easy matchups. There's even 4 Umbra Ranger, which, now that I think about it, that's probably a very volatile matchup as well. It all depends if they see their turbo, if you see your turbo, and there's probably a lot of first versus second as well. The number of Razor Gales making day 2 is less than I expected. So in hindsight, maybe I over prepared for Razor Gale given how many made day 2, but I did face a Razor Gale. My sideboard did come into play, so it's not like it wasn't for nothing. Going over the deck briefly, if you want to get a highlight of what the deck does, please check out my last video from Ascent Niagara. I'm only going to talk about a couple changes or some considerations that I had. Even until the final hour, I was thinking whether or not I should fit Alcahest in the build, and if I do fit it, it was going to be over Nullifying Lantern. The last second decision, I decided to keep Nullifying Lantern because if I face fire aggro, if I face Genbu, I would prefer having Null Lantern in the build. And Alcahest, really, like, where do I really want Alcahest? It's just against Oblation. Everything else I think is manageable without Alcahest. Sure, it'll come in more instances across just the broader deck spectrum because it can hit like Tariff Ring, Safeguard Amulet, weapons and whatnot. But when I think about how many materializations the ride deck goes through over the course of a game, you're going to go through your level 1, 2, 3, and your Grail book. And then outside of that, you might have 1 or 2 more materializations. And how critical or how often will I be able to get to the point where I'm going to materialize Alcahest? And I didn't think it was going to be that often. And so I kind of had this Null Lantern for kind of longer term games where, if I face a Genbu, I'll probably get Null Lantern out at some point. If I face against fire aggro, it's going to come out at some point to stabilize from graveyard threats. So that was kind of my intention. And given the percentage of Oblation decks in Niagara, I thought to myself, Niagara and Auckland, I thought to myself, if it comes up once, I'll just take the auto loss against it, similar to Fractals. But when I saw the early field, I had a bad feeling that it was the wrong decision, and I ended up facing the Oblation deck much earlier than I expected, unfortunately. Main deck, the only change that I made was I took out a Summon Gale and put in 1 Resolute stand because I wanted to stand a better chance against aggro in game 1. And I know some people cut the 3 visits, go down to 3/3 visits, and instead of cutting the Summon Gale. But 3 visits to me is such a critical card in crafting your early game banishments and healing, and kind of helps towards that protection against early game pressure, that I didn't really want to decrease my glimpses and healing. The way I thought about it was any cards that I want to keep in the early game, I want as many of those as possible. And Summon Gale is more of a more situational card, and considering it doesn't go card neutral as much as Disorienting Winds, I just valued it less than Disorienting Winds. Overall, even against like Crux decks, there's been more Crux Lorraines than Crux Merlins, and those Lorraine decks can sometimes put on a decent amount of pressure and have some early game big damage between Rending Flames and Home by Fire and some Even some burst cards, I think I've seen some Intensified Pyre and Sparkleites in there. So I wanted Resolute Stand just so my first game I'm properly prepared against any early game aggression. Sideboard, I made a few changes to the sideboard. First, you'll see that I took out the Blanche and the um, and the and the Vanish from sites, and I decided to put in Scatter Essence. And Scatter Essence was mainly for Razor Gale. It's not enough by itself against Fractal matchups. And if I were knowing that I would face two Fractal matchups, I probably would have, in addition to the Scatter Essence, fit in another three Blanches. And that's kind of the only way you stand a chance against them. You got to be able to slow them down in the early game and present a lot of roadblocks between Safeguard Amulet, Undergrail, and Blanches to survive that matchup. But that's just given the percentage of the meta and how much of sideboard slots it would take up to, I wouldn't even say you have an advantage with all of that. You're probably still on the losing end, but at least it's playable. It's just way too much to sideboard for. So I was definitely okay with losing against the Fractals matchup. Nullifying Mirror as well. I would say you need both the Mirror and the Scatter Essences to be able to deal with Razor Gale, because just the Scatter Essences alone, it's possible for them to get their Razor Gales back on the field between Cyclical Breeze and finding more Razor Gales by glimpsing and drawing out their deck. And while Scatter Essences can slow down the ramp up of their damage, they can still defend themselves quite nicely against Windride between Innervate Agilities and Veiling Breeze and cycling their Veiling Breezes. I tend to side out the Null Lantern for Mirror because I didn't really see the point of shutting down their Cyclical Breeze if I can just shut them out of the game by negating their Veiling Breezes or forcing them to play two on the critical turns. So those two in conjunction, not only the Scatter Essences slow them down, while the Mirror kind of speeds up your kill lines. I also kept two Crystallized Destinies for any early game big damage from aggro, and as an additional shield option against the dragon. And of course, a fourth Resolute if I find like hyper aggro decks, and Ravaging Tempest to deal with Shinju decks. I updated the matchup spread a little bit here, but it's pretty much the same as the last video. I just made a little shakeup again for the losing matchups, putting Razor Gale at 3070 at the start. But if you sideboard a Mirror and Scatters, this is at least a 45-55, and it's kind of dependent on how much defense they run, to how many Eternal Magistrates they run. It's possible that it's at least 50-50, possibly even slightly winning depending on their build. But I would never say like overall, like between game 1 through game 3, that it's a winning matchup just because Mirror and Scatters are all on the side. So game 1 is generally an uphill match. And then I put Oblation as 2080 without Alcahest. But I think with Alcahest, that Umbra Seal, considering all types between the Beguiling Coup and Oblation builds, and if any of them are running water still, 60-40 is probably about the right average. And then I just kind of clarified, I think previously maybe I had fractals as 40-60 or 30-70. I've moved a couple of the aggressive matchups down to 30-70. Aether Wing is one that I moved down as well. Just difficult to deal with because you can't really interact with their attack swings, and especially since I took out Vanish from sights, I can't really slow them down from their milling and value post sideboard. I'll talk a little bit about the opening hand and kind of the early game. So when I glimpse off Fortuitous Spirit, it does matter if you go first or second. So if you go second, you have the play of being able to disorienting winds a dungeon guide without having to go backup charger. So that's one consideration. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. I also think about, when you're going first and you're facing against a unknown list, what would I keep? And in the high priority, I always try to keep 3 visits, dungeon guide, and fluffy shopkeep. Ideally, I would have one of each. And with fluffy shopkeep and 3 visits, there's the possibility that I go start off with backup charger, because not only am I going first and I have a tempo on materialization, fluffy shopkeep defense and 3 visits healing can allow me to sustain a higher health count against early game pressure. So if they're a deck where I think I'm going to need more influence, especially, getting backup charger is certainly a route that I go pretty often. You might have seen it on my stream games that I do like to go backup charger right away. What 3 visits also helps against is that if I don't know what they're playing, I don't really like to commit to having a resolute stand, but 3 visits is kind of a middle ground where it'll give me some healing and allow me to try to find a resolute stand if it turns out that I do need a resolute stand. In the end, it can also help craft your early arcane draws, because sometimes you end up with a hand of a ton of arcane cards, and maybe sometimes you end up with not enough playable cards. And 3 visits with backup charger, you can see a decent amount of cards in the opener to kind of draw you up, to find additional cards to play to get you to level 3. Dungeon guide, sometimes I'm willing to keep 2 if it's against a aggressive matchup, because I'm against aggro, you don't really have the time to get backup charger. So there are situations where I want to ensure that I have a dungeon guide in hand, and if I inadvertently banish a dungeon guide for the immediate level up, I still end up being okay. And it wouldn't be too unusual for me to level up to 1 and then immediately play a dungeon guide to level up to 2 to be able to have 3 visits get value off the level 2 ability of getting an enlightenment counter on the inherited effect of Fry. And you also put yourself at a higher health, but you don't need to turbo up to 3 because you have that second dungeon guide, so you can potentially go Grail Book and then dungeon guide again with your second dungeon guide. Now I'll go over some of the conditional priority cards. So if I don't really see any of the high priority cards in the early game, I do want to keep a charm, because I don't want to end up in a situation where I have no playables after leveling up to level 1. So charm becomes kind of an insurance option. It also becomes a luxury pick against a more passive deck. So if I have, let's say, 3 visits, dungeon guide, and fluffy shopkeep, for example, there's the possibility that I'll keep charm for some matchups, because I know I can, let's say if I go I banished to go to I go to level 1, and then I can play Fluffy Shopkeep plus a charm potentially. It just kind of depends if I have what my opening hand is like, and if I'm digging for more cards. So if I don't have Dungeon Guide, for example, I may play like Fluffy Shopkeep plus Charm in order to draw a card off Fluffy Shopkeep, draw a card off Charm to dig further into the deck. Disorienting Winds, this is to me a must keep if you have Dungeon Guide. If you don't have Dungeon Guide, I don't really like keeping Disorienting Winds. And you've probably seen this in some of my videos, some of my stream matches, where I would Dungeon Guide and then Disorienting Winds to bounce the Dungeon Guide back to my hand. It's just such a great influence play, and knowing that I have that combination allows me to craft my banishings even better. Because if I'm keeping a hand like Fluffy Shopkeep, Dungeon Guide, 3 Visits, and Disorienting Winds, and then I'm drawing another 3 into memory, it's very possible that I run fairly low on arcane cards. And Disorienting Winds, being able to draw a card off Disorienting Winds, being able to gain the enlightenment counter off level 2 allows me to see 2 additional cards for me to properly craft the banishing in a subsequent turn. Likely that subsequent turn is going to be me getting out Grail and putting the Tome of Knowledge underneath. What this also allows me to do is I can have Dungeon Guide be my only play on level 1. So if I banish to go to level 1 off Fortuitous Spirit, and I have Dungeon Guide and Disorienting Winds, that's all I need to bridge myself into level 3, because you'll play Dungeon Guide to go to level 2, then Disorienting Winds to get it back. Now, as I mentioned, that play is not possible if you're going first, but if you go second, I like that play because you have the extra influence to be able to make that play, first of all. And 2, it lets you catch up a bit in the materialization tempo. Then Resolute Stand, if I know my opponent is an aggressive deck, so if I know that they're Pfizer, I know that they're a chicken deck, I'll want to keep a Resolute Stand in my opening hand. And typically it's just keeping 1, because you still need to have cards to level up, and you don't really want to use Resolute Stand just for the sake of leveling up. Then if you have everything that you can ask for in terms of your opening glimpse, so let's say I've got 3 Visits, Dungeon Guide, and Fluffy Shopkeep, and Disorienting Winds, I wouldn't mind keeping a Scribe the Skies, because that's your engine to really ramp up once you hit level 3. So, if I keep 5 cards, typically the 5 is 1 3 Visits, 1 Dungeon Guide, 1 Fluffy Shopkeep, 1 Disorienting Winds, and 1 Scribe the Skies. And I hope my remaining cards are arcane. And with 3 Visits, you can craft your subsequent draws to make sure that you find more arcane cards. I don't mind being at like level 7 or so from arcane cards when it comes to leveling up, because I do have the Tome of Knowledge. And if you have the Scry, it's not too difficult for you to kind of manipulate the draws and glimpses so that you can banish more arcane cards once you go to level 3 and be able to catch up on influence using Scry the Skies as you try to find your careful studies. So that's generally how I approach the early game. There's a lot of nuance depending on what exactly that you face, or if you don't, or if you're going in blind and how to kind of react and adjust based on what your opponent is playing. And I think that's what makes this deck quite hard because the way that you have to play the deck differs quite a bit depending on if you're facing against aggro, if you're facing against level 3. And I also think a lot of folks are not used to using their life as a resource. In a lot of other decks, you're mainly worried about how to play the deck itself. With Rye, you're also playing with your life pool because what you can afford to take as damage could influence how much influence you have. For example, if I use a Resolute Stand, that's one influence I won't have in my subsequent kill turn. So you think, do I have to use the Resolute Stand? Am I able to greed that additional influence and take on that damage? Oftentimes I play games, there are a lot of games where I'm hovering around 20 damage. And that fine line, being able to walk that tightrope, I think is very difficult for a lot of players. I think if you don't walk that tightrope, you might find yourself, I can't accomplish this kill line, or I wasn't able to dig that extra card because I didn't have the influence. And so these considerations, even when it comes to some of the favorable matchups, like against Crux Lorraine, where they can have some early game pressure, they can have their Clarent out. It's not the easiest to play, and if you don't navigate that correctly from a life standpoint and a resource standpoint, you can easily get blown out of the game. So when I see not too many Rise convert. There is some matchup luck to this. It's a very polarizing deck, but I think even in favorable matchups, even in situations where they don't break their hand, there's still a lot of decisions to be made, and it's difficult to make those right decisions from a life and resource standpoint if you don't have a lot of reps on the deck. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the matchups here. I finished 9-4-1. I'm not going to go over every single one. But you can see in the early goings, I was through round 5. I was 3-2. Just had a brick draw against the Firecrux Merlin. Didn't have Alcahest for Oblation. So I was kind of in a tough spot. But from there, I feel like I did quite well. And I don't really regret the way that I played in a lot of these decisions. I knew Arisana Fractals was going to be pretty much an auto loss. And it's unfortunate I faced that in round 9. I would have loved any other matchup other than this and in those other 30-70 matchups. And I was able to take a game, and I thought to myself, if I can somehow get to 7-2, I could have a chance in making a run on day 2, but it just wasn't meant to be. Day 2, I faced against a Fire Jin, and I was surprised to see Jin there, and I would say this is quite an unfavorable matchup. I wouldn't put it at 30-70, but it's pretty close to being that bad. The way I played it was I set up the defense Regalius, and I just push a bunch of damage to Jin and hope that they can't kill me because I've got Safeguard Amulet, because I've got the Tariff Ring out, and I'm holding a bunch of Spell Shield Arcane. But it's a difficult proposition because they run Incapacitate. They touch you once with a big swing and you're dead. I was fortunate to win that matchup 2-1 because game 1, they didn't see Dungeon Guide. I had the perfect turbo and just killed them before they could reach level 3. Game 2 was about kind of what I expected. I didn't really have an early kill line, and they just gathered too much influence and was able to kill me when I did set up and try to go for lethal. And then in game 3, we were pushed into overtime. It was one of those situations where, I had to go for it if I wanted to win. He had to go for it if he wanted to win. I had the defense set up, but I put him only at 48 damage, and he still had his Serene Spirit. And I'm pretty sure he could have healed it all back if he wanted to and draw out and make the match a draw. But he decided to go for it, and I had enough influence to pay for double spell shield. He was able to incap one, but didn't have enough influence to incap the other. So I managed to win just because he went for it. But if the game had gone on for like another 2 turns, I'm pretty sure I would lose. So that was fortunate. Razor Gale, it kind of performed against Razor Gale. The deck performed as I expected. Got blown out game 1 because they found double Razor Gale and I had none of the defense. Game 2 and 3, I found at least 2 scatter essences in both games, and took those games because basically each time you take out a Razor Gale, that slows them down for a turn. And if you give Rye like 2-3 turns, then you're pretty much gonna die, especially with Mirror coming out during the kill turn. And lastly, I just kind of ID'd with Fire Bloom Dow because at the end, there really wasn't anything to play for. I could only get top 100 regardless if I win or lost. So nothing much to say there. I think that one is somewhat 50-50. It just kind of depends what sort of Fantasia. It's a little bit like Fractals, but they're a lot more reliant on seeing Fire Bloom in like the early game Fractals, and if they don't, early game Fantasias, and if they don't see it, you could kind of run that deck over. But if they see what they need, like the Ravenous Pyres and Fire Blooms, it's a lot of pressure against Rye in the early game. To wrap things up, with this being the end of the season, I'll probably get out another video that's about top cards that I think have potential in Rye for the next set for PTM. And I do want to go over the stream match that I had on day 2 against the Fire Cruxler, just kind of talk about my thought process throughout the match. I know I wanted to get something like that out before Ascent Akihabara, but there's just so much going on leading up to the event with work and kind of getting all of that taken care of. Finally had a chance to get this video out, getting over my jet lag, go into Thanksgiving break. So do look forward to those 2 videos coming up, and I hope for those that celebrate Thanksgiving that y'all have a great holidays, and I hope to see y'all soon.